Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before 8 military vehicles rolled into Seattle General with a rear admiral demanding to see Valkyrie. Hannah Clarke had no idea the clock was already running. She arrives at Seattle General at 05:05, her scrubs still creased from the hospital laundry, her badge clipped precisely at the sternum where it should be. 2 years of civilian trauma nursing experience, according to her resume. 2 years of careful fabrication. 6 months of actual fieldwork in this San Diego hospital, her hand steady as a surgical laser even when she's changing dressings on a Navy intelligence officer whose injuries, shrapnel wounds from an IED blast in Helmand Province, tell stories that only a few people in the world are cleared to hear. She knows those stories. All of them. The pre-dawn hallway of Seattle General smells like antiseptic and the faint copper of old blood that the cleaning crews never quite eradicate. Her footsteps make no sound on the polished linoleum. She has trained herself to move like that, economical, precise, invisible. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead with their characteristic electrical hum, casting shadows across her forearms. Faint scars run the length of both wrists, thin white lines beneath the skin like a map of surgery or survival. Her long sleeves cover them completely. No one asks about scars in a hospital. Everyone has a story they don't want to tell. In the locker room, she hangs her jacket on hook 17 and exchanges her street clothes for the uniform that has become her armor. Her locker is bare except for folded scrubs and a single object she touches every shift before she starts. A tarnished military challenge coin. Helmand Province, 2019. The metal is dark with oxidation and marked with a dent from shrapnel that never quite extracted itself from the coin's edge. She turns it over between her fingers, once, twice, 3 times, a ritual that takes approximately 43 seconds. Her hands know the exact count. Everything in her life is measured in precise increments now. Time until extraction. Time until the intelligence she's protecting reaches the Admiral's hands. Time until she can be herself again. The limp is barely perceptible. Most people don't notice it unless she's been standing for more than 6 hours. She attributes it to a car accident from her cover story, a single-vehicle collision on IR-5 6 years ago that never happened. The limp actually comes from a 7.62 mm round through the anterior tibialis during her second tour in Jalabad. Pain is data. Pain is information. Pain is just another set of vital signs to monitor. Room 407 sits at the end of the northeast corridor. Her patient, Commander James Reeves, though that name exists in only 3 secure databases, lies in a standard hospital bed with a cardiac monitor tracing his steady heartbeat across the screen. His vital signs are stable. BP 118/74. Heart rate 62. O2 saturation 98% on room air. He's healing. The abdominal trauma is resolving. The infection markers are dropping. By her calculations, he'll be cleared to leave in 9 more days, and the intelligence he's holding about the mole embedded in Naval Medical Command will go with him to the Pentagon in a secure briefing room where Hannah Clarke will cease to exist. Until then, she is just a nurse. A soft-spoken transfer from the civilian side. 2 years of experience. Completely unremarkable. She adjusts the flow rate, 250 milliliters per hour, exactly as the morning shift requires, and makes notes in his chart with a neat, anonymous handwriting that reveals nothing. The room smells like the medicinal scent of antiseptic wipes and the underlying funk of human illness that soap and water cannot quite touch. The ventilator in the corner sits idle. His lungs are clear. The monitor continues its steady beep. 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 A metronome of recovery. His SATs look good. Her voice comes out soft, deferential, exactly as it should. The words of someone who understands hierarchy, who defers to authority, who knows her place in the ladder. She moves through the next 4 hours like she's been choreographed into the hospital's existing ballet. She takes temperatures. She documents output. She changes wound dressings with the precise, methodical motions of someone who has done this thousands of times, though not in any of the hospitals that her resume lists. The other nurses treat her with the mild indifference they show to all new transfers. She speaks when spoken to. She asks permission before deviating from protocols. She makes herself small. At 08:47, Dr. Whitfield arrives for morning rounds. He moves through the ICU like he owns it, and in a fundamental way, he does. 22 years as the Chief of Trauma Surgery at Seattle General. Board certification in 3 specialties. Published research that gets cited in journals that people actually read. A reputation built on brilliant work and a talent for making sure everyone knows about the brilliant work. He wears his white coat like a cape. His voice carries the confidence of someone who has never been questioned and has no intention of starting. Hannah stands at the nurse's station, reviewing the morning labs on the computer terminal. The screen glows pale blue against her face. She hears him before she sees him, his voice carrying across the ward, that particular tone of authority that makes other doctors straighten their spines. Let's review the Reeves patient. His eyes scan the chart she's prepared. I see he's been ambulating. Who authorized that? He requested it. Hannah's voice remains level, professional, deferential. A nurse's voice. His orthopedic status supports it. No contraindications in his surgical clearance. Whitfield's eyes narrow. He turns to look at her fully, really look at her, for the first time since she transferred in 6 months ago. His gaze moves across her face, her hands, her posture, searching for something he can't quite name. She feels the weight of his attention like pressure. Like he's trying to see through her. She doesn't flinch. Her hands remain still. His orthopedic status. Whitfield repeats the words back to her like they're a challenge. That's not your call to make, Nurse Clarke. The protocol is clear. Patients in his condition remain on bed rest until I sign the clearance. Hannah has read the protocol. It's actually outdated. The latest trauma literature, published within the last 18 months in the Journal of Trauma Surgery, suggests early ambulation significantly improves outcomes and reduces thrombotic complications. But she doesn't say that. She doesn't explain the research. She doesn't challenge the brilliant surgeon who has built his reputation on outdated methods that make him feel powerful. She simply nods. Understood, doctor. I'll restrict him to bed rest. But something in Whitfield's face tightens. He recognizes deference that masks something underneath. A nurse who doesn't just accept his authority, a nurse who knows why his authority is wrong, and chooses not to say so. That recognition makes him angry in a way he can't quite articulate. The morning progresses. By 11:42, the cafeteria fills with the lunch crowd. Hannah carries her tray, a salad she didn't want, water with no ice, and a protein bar, into the fluorescent brightness where 50 other hospital employees chew and talk and exist in the simple comfort of people who have nothing to hide. She chooses a table in the corner. It's instinct. Always position yourself with visibility of exits and approach vectors. Always maintain spatial awareness. Always eat with your back covered. Whitfield walks past her table at 1143 hours. He's alone. No one else is coming. Hannah doesn't see it until the last second, the shift in his stride, the slight angle of his approach, the calculation in his eyes. She has approximately 1.3 seconds to process his intention. His hand strikes the edge of her tray with the force of deliberation, not accident. The tray rotates counterclockwise through the air with slow-motion clarity. The water glass follows a separate trajectory. Salad scatters across the white tile floor. The protein bar bounces once, twice, slides under the adjacent table. The room does not go quiet immediately. There's a lag, maybe half a second, where people are still chewing, still talking, still existing in the moment before they realize what just happened. Then the ambient noise dies. Whitfield stands above her, his white coat pressed and pristine, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who has successfully demonstrated power. "How clumsy of you," he says. His voice is conversational, almost friendly. You should be more careful, sweetheart. These things happen quickly if you're not paying attention. Hannah's hands grip the edge of the table. She can feel her knuckles whitening, not from fear. From the careful application of pressure required to maintain absolute stillness. The trembling that wants to escape is not fear. It is restraint. It is a 23-year veteran of the United States Navy holding back what she is actually capable of doing with her hands. She stands. Slowly. Her jaw clamps once, a visible flex of muscle, and then releases. Her face remains a perfect mask of professional composure. "My apologies, doctor," she says. Her voice is soft. Deferential. The voice of someone who accepts her place in the hierarchy. "I'll clean this up." She bends down. Gathers the scattered salad with her hands. Picks up the water glass. Retrieves the protein bar from under the adjacent table while 3 people watch her, 1 with satisfaction, 2 with embarrassment that they're witnessing something they shouldn't acknowledge. When she stands, her tray is reassembled, her expression has returned to neutral, and she turns away from Whitfield without making eye contact. The pen she's holding in her left hand has been gripped so tightly that her knuckles have gone white. She can see it. She turns her hand to face her palm, and the blood rushes back into her fingers. One of her hands has held an abdominal cavity open with sutures and tissue grafts while mortar fire impacted the operating tent's sandbag wall. The other has applied a tourniquet to a femoral artery severing in a combat medic who bled out anyway, for months later, from complications that developed stateside. These hands know what they're capable of. But that wasn't the worst part. Whitfield watches her walk away from the cafeteria, and he smiles. That smile says he's won. That smile says he's identified the weakness, a soft-spoken transfer who challenges protocols and doesn't belong. He's testing to see how hard she'll break. How long before she cracks under pressure. He has no idea what he's actually testing. Hannah disposes of the scattered food in the trash. She rinses her hands at the sink in the back of the cafeteria. The water runs clear. Her hands steady. The man who takes the shift after her has already noticed her scrubs are wet, and he doesn't ask questions about it. No one asks questions about the small disasters of working in a hospital. Everyone is too busy managing their own collapsing life to wonder about hers. By 1400 hours, she's back in the ICU. Commander Reeves is stable. His monitor still traces that steady rhythm. Beep. 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 The metronome of a man who will live long enough to walk into a Pentagon briefing room and testify about the mole that Whitfield never could have imagined exists. That's when the Marine shows up. He's not assigned to the ICU. He appears in the corridor at 14:07 wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a black t-shirt that strains slightly against shoulders that have carried body armor and ammunition for longer than most people have adult careers. His right arm moves with the precision of someone with physical therapy in their recent history. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Halloway, according to the visitor log that Hannah checks later. He claims to be a friend of Commander Reeves. The nursing staff clears him to visit. He's not visiting Reeves. Or at least, not entirely. He watches Hannah change the dressing on a wound in adjacent room for 06. Watches her hands move through the procedure with the economical precision that has nothing to do with civilian nursing training. She's performing a field suture technique, the stitching pattern refined over 3 tours in Helmand Province. The kind of technique that gets taught at SOAR combat medic schools. Not at the civilian nursing programs her resume claims she completed. He doesn't approach until she's documented everything and moved into the corridor. Then he steps into her path with his body angled at what he calculates is non-threatening distance, approximately 2.4 meters. Her hand doesn't move to a weapon because she's not carrying one. But her body positioning adjusts fractionally. That suture pattern. His voice is quiet. Military quiet. The voice of someone trained to communicate across a distance without elevation. Where'd you really learn to tie off like that? Hannah's face remains neutral. Her eyes meet his for exactly 2.3 seconds before looking away. I'm not sure what you mean, Gunnery Sergeant. He smiles like he's made a point with someone who understands the point. Right. Of course you don't. He walks away before she can respond. By the time Hannah processes the interaction, he's already past the nurse's station and heading toward the elevator. She has no way of knowing he's already making a phone call. No way of knowing that call reaches the Pentagon's secure line. No way of knowing that call contains 3 words that will start the machinery turning. 3 words: we found Valkyrie. The morning conference room at Seattle General smelled like burnt coffee and drywall paint. 30 staff members sat in folding chairs arranged in 3 careful rows, attending the weekly protocol briefing that Dr. Marcus Whitfield had transformed into something closer to a stadium. He stood at the head of the table, his Italian loafers gleaming under fluorescent lights, his white coat pristine in a way that suggested he never actually treated patients. Hannah sat in the 3rd row, her pen poised over her notebook, her face the careful neutral expression she'd perfected over 6 months of cover work. Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat. The room quieted. Our newest transfer, Nurse Clarke, has some interesting ideas about my protocols, he announced, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being amusing in rooms that had learned to laugh on cue. She's challenged my orders twice this week alone. Questioned my suture technique. Suggested alternatives to established procedures. He smiled, the kind of smile that had power behind it. So I've decided to make this fun. I'm betting our esteemed colleague here quits within 7 days. Anyone want to take the under? Nervous laughter rippled through the room like a wave through shallow water. Residents exchanged glances. Attending physicians nodded as if this were the cleverest thing they'd heard all month. A surgical tech in the back row actually raised her hand in a pretend bid. The humor was the kind that only works when everyone understands the true target isn't the joke, it's the person being laughed at. Hannah's jaw clenched once, almost invisibly, just a brief tightening of the masseter muscle beneath her skin. She watched the movement pass through her body like she was observing it happen to someone else, then smoothed her expression back to absolute calm. Her pen remained steady in her hand as she wrote a single word in her notebook, noted. The handwriting was precise, military straight, the kind of penmanship that came from years of documenting trauma under triage conditions. She looked up, met Whitfield's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in deference, but in simple acknowledgement. Then she returned to her notes as if the briefing had never deviated from its original trajectory. Whitfield's smile faltered just slightly. He'd expected something different. A flush. A tremor. The quiet cracking of a soft-spoken woman who'd suddenly realized the full weight of institutional contempt. Instead, he'd gotten stillness. He'd gotten the kind of composure that didn't bend under social pressure because it had been forged in environments where social pressure meant something very different than what happened in conference rooms. 3 days later, the cafeteria during lunch rush. The room hummed with the particular chaos of a hospital midshift, the kind of organized pandemonium where nurses grabbed meals between charting, residents inhaled sandwiches between rounds, and the smell of industrial beef broth mixed with hand sanitizer created an oddly specific sensory signature. Hannah carried her tray, soup, salad, a bottle of water, past the doctor's table where Whitfield sat with 3 attending physicians and a surgical resident who'd learned the hierarchy by watching who got laughed at first. She moved past with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile spaces without drawing attention. Whitfield rose from his seat with the kind of casual deliberation that only works when you know there will be no consequences. He angled his shoulder slightly. One motion, barely noticeable to someone not looking for it. His arm connected with her tray at the perfect angle to redirect its trajectory without appearing like anything but accident. The tray fell. Soup splashed across the tile in a 3-foot radius, a Rorschach test of vegetable broth. The bowl shattered. The plate cracked. The water bottle bounced and rolled beneath a table, still somehow full, its plastic side caving in under the impact. The sound of breaking ceramic cut through the cafeteria's ambient noise like a scalpel. 50 people turned to watch. Clumsy, Whitfield said, loud enough for everyone in a 10-foot radius to hear. His voice carried the tone of someone commenting on the weather. Maybe nursing school didn't cover walking. The doctors at his table laughed. Two residents exchanged glances. A cafeteria worker by the serving line actually winced, sympathetic or embarrassed. Hannah couldn't tell which. She knelt without hesitation. No dramatic pause. No moment where her breath caught or her hands trembled. She simply lowered herself to the ground and began gathering the pieces, her movements methodical and precise. Her hands were steady as she collected broken ceramic, stacked the pieces in a neat pile, wiped up soup with paper towels she'd pulled from her pocket. She always kept them there, a habit from another life entirely. Her face was a perfect mask. Blank. Professional. The kind of expression you wear when you've been humiliated in front of people before, and you've learned that dignity is a luxury that only matters if you care what these people think of you. She stood, holding the broken tray, and met Whitfield's eyes for exactly 1 second. Not a glare. Not a challenge. Just acknowledgement. The look of someone taking his measure, the way you might observe something in a specimen jar. Then she walked to the dish return without a word, disposed of the debris, and moved toward the exit. The other nurses watched her go. Some exchanged glances. Some stared at their food. None of them said anything. Whitfield had been at Seattle General for 12 years. People who challenged him didn't last, they transferred, they quit, they mysteriously lost favor on the hospital's best committees. Solidarity was a luxury nobody could afford. But that wasn't the worst part. Day 6, shift change at the nurses' station. The station buzzed with the transition between shifts, nurses passing off patients, discussing vitals, documenting the day's events in the electronic records system. Whitfield approached from the direction of the physician's lounge, 3 patient charts tucked under his arm with the kind of casual hold that suggested he wasn't really thinking about them. He reached Hannah's station, where she was updating a medication log, and dropped the charts in front of her. Not handed. Dropped. The papers scattered across the desk and onto the floor below, a cascade of documented medical histories and treatment plans spreading like someone had tossed a handful of playing cards. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the particular condescension of a man who'd been permitted to speak to women this way for so long that it no longer registered as anything but casual. "And next time, maybe read them before you question my orders in front of residents." Hannah set down her pen with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that her next 3 seconds would be documented and reported. She crouched, not kneeled, crouched, the position requiring control and balance, the position someone uses when they're prepared to move quickly in any direction. She gathered the papers with the same steady hands that had retrieved broken dishes, the same hands that had started full lines under fire, the same hands that had performed emergency pericardiocentesis on a soldier whose lungs were collapsing from fluid pressure. She arranged the scattered charts into a neat stack, reading each patient name as she did, filing the information away with the ease of someone whose memory had been trained by necessity. Her breathing remained controlled. Not shallow, not rapid. Normal. The kind of breathing that came from understanding that panic was a luxury and composure was a weapon. Only when she turned away, charts in hand, did her grip tighten on her pen hard enough to leave marks, small crescent indentations where her fingernails pressed into plastic, the trembling that came not from fear but from restraint, from the deliberate act of choosing not to respond in ways that her training and her muscle memory and her very specific set of skills had prepared her to respond. The other nurses exchanged glances. The surgical resident looked away. The tech updating the whiteboard with patient census numbers suddenly became very focused on her task. Nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. Hannah moved through the rest of her shift with a kind of precision that suggested she wasn't there at all, that she was operating on a different plane, executing protocols with the kind of effortless competence that made experienced medical professionals quiet when she entered a room. At 1,400 hours, the emergency lights activated. A motorcycle had collided with a delivery truck at the intersection of 4th and Mission. The rider had gone into the truck's trailer. Multiple trauma alert. The patient was 5 minutes out. The ER transformed instantly from controlled chaos into something closer to combat conditions, controlled, organized, but humming with the particular tension that only comes when you know someone's life is going to be determined in the next 60 seconds. Hannah moved into position at the trauma bay as the ambulance pulled under the awning, its mechanical door hissing open like the breath of something vast and terrible. The paramedics called out vitals with the practiced cadence of people who delivered this report 100 times. Male, 24, motorcycle versus truck, massive trauma, compound fractures bilateral legs, hemorrhaging from left thigh, BP dropping, we've got a tourniquet but the bleeding is ongoing. The patient came through on the stretcher like something broken from a machine. The trauma surgeon, a woman named Dr. Chen, was already present, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd made these decisions 300 times. Hannah positioned herself at the patient's left side, anticipating the next instrument before Chen called for it, her hands already knowing where the next suture kit would need to be placed. Femoral artery is compromised, Chen called out. We need pressure. Now. Hannah was already there. She had the 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand before Chen finished the sentence, her fingers moving with a precision that had nothing to do with civilian nursing school and everything to do with 6 years of forward surgical protocols in Helmand Province. She found the access point with her first attempt, established the line, and began the process of stabilizing the hemorrhage with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this operation in the dark under mortar fire. The patient coded. His heart rhythm became something chaotic and purposeless on the monitor, a squiggly line that meant time was now being measured in seconds. Hannah called for sutures without waiting for permission, her voice dropping an octave, and began a complex field tie-off technique that required the kind of steady hands that only came from understanding that panic was not compatible with survival. She tied off the vessel with 45 seconds to spare, using a modified surgical knot that she'd learned from a mentor who'd been shot twice and saved a Marine platoon at 72 kilometers from the nearest operating room. Her fingers moved with muscle memory so deep that her conscious mind seemed to step aside and let her hands do the work they'd been trained to do since before she'd ever heard of Seattle General or Dr. Whitfield or anything else that belonged to her cover story. The room stabilized. The heart monitor returned to a rhythm that wasn't sinus but was at least purposeful, at least survivable. Dr. Chen glanced at Hannah with something that might have been surprise, might have been recognition, might have been the dawning realization that something was very wrong with the backstory of this transfer nurse. Good work, Chen said, and they wheeled the patient toward surgery. As they moved through the hallway, a figure stepped out from the corner near the orthopedic supply closet. Male, late 30s, with the kind of bearing that suggested military experience, his eyes tracking Hannah's hands even though the crisis had already passed. He wore civilian clothes but moved like someone who'd never quite shed the muscle memory of fatigues. He waited until they'd rounded the corner with the stretcher, then approached Hannah. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that only works between people who understand what they're talking about without needing to say much. Where'd you really learn to tie off like that? His eyes held something that might have been recognition, might have been a threat, might have been both. That's not Seattle General technique. That's not civilian anything. That's Helmand Province field medicine. I'd know that not in the dark. I learned it from the same people you did. Hannah's face didn't change. The practiced civilian nurse mask remained intact, complete with the appropriate level of confusion and the slight tilt of her head that suggested she was trying to understand what this stranger wanted from her. YouTube has everything these days, she said, her tone light, conversational, the kind of tone you use when you're lying to someone who knows you're lying but hasn't yet decided whether to report it. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her pocket, where the tarnished challenge coin from Helmand Province sat heavy against her thigh, the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to carry into this cover, the only reminder that underneath the scrubs and the deferential posture and the civilian backstory, she was still Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. The coin was warm against her skin, smooth from 6 years of being turned over and over by someone who understood what it meant, the inscription worn nearly illegible, pain is the teacher. Competence is the currency. The Marine medic nodded slowly, unconvinced, and walked away. But he didn't leave the hospital. He made a phone call somewhere private, his voice too quiet for anyone to hear, and somewhere in a Pentagon office 600 miles away, someone picked up a classified line and said exactly 3 words. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Hannah returned to the nurse's station where Dr. Whitfield was reviewing the trauma chart, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her stomach tighten. His eyes moved across the documentation, lingering on the medical terms that shouldn't have been there, the procedural notes that didn't match the profile of someone with 2 years of civilian nursing experience. He looked up, met her eyes for a moment, and something like recognition flickered across his face before he returned to the chart. The challenge coin pressed against her thigh like a weight, like an anchor, like a countdown timer she couldn't hear but could somehow feel in her bones. Her cover had just developed its first crack. And 3 hours away, someone was loading equipment into a convoy. The trauma alert screamed through Seattle General's intercom at 1,347 hours. Motorcycle versus delivery truck on Harbor Drive. Multiple fractures, severe hemorrhaging, ETA 5 minutes. Hannah was restocking the trauma bay when the announcement crackled overhead, and her hands went still for exactly 1 second, the only tell that anyone with military training would recognize. Then muscle memory took over. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before mortar fire and dust storms and the smell of cordite mixing with antiseptic. The stretcher rolled through the bay doors at 13:52. A Marine Corps Staff Sergeant, 28 years old, his left leg bent at angles that suggested the femur was fractured in at least 2 places. Blood soaked through the field dressing like water through paper. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Chen, was already calling orders, type and cross, 2 units of O negative, get me a pelvic X-ray and a CT of the abdomen. But Chen was working from protocols. Hannah was working from muscle memory that had been forged in a surgical tent outside San Jin Valley with mortars walking closer every 7 seconds. She moved to the patient's right side without being asked. The Marine's eyes found hers, that particular look of someone who recognized something in her stance, her hands, the way she anticipated what came next before the doctor said it aloud. Pressure dressing on the femoral wound, Hannah said quietly, not to Chen but to the registered nurse standing opposite her. The RN hesitated for a fraction of a second, the way people do when they hear someone speak with authority who isn't supposed to have it yet. Hannah's voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The needle went in. 18 gauge, direct into the femoral vein. Hannah's hands moved like they were operating on their own, which they were, because part of her brain was somewhere else, somewhere with sand under her fingernails and the weight of someone's life balanced on the edge of a scalpel. The fall line was in place before Chen finished his next sentence. The rhythm of the trauma response clicked into place like gears meshing, and suddenly Hannah wasn't a civilian nurse with 2 years of experience. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer running a surgical protocol that had kept 214 Marines alive across 3 tours in Helmand Province. 02 SAT was climbing. 72. 78. 85. The compression dressing on the femoral wound had slowed the hemorrhage to something manageable. Chen was calling for orthopedic surgery consultation and a CT scan, but Hannah was already calculating the next 45 minutes, fluid replacement, blood transfusion protocol, stabilization for transport to OR. Her fingers found the patient's radial pulse. Present. Strong. Not the fluttering weakness of hypovolemic shock. Yet. The Marine's eyes tracked hers again. "You've done this before," he said, his voice barely audible beneath the ventilator's wheeze and the heart monitor's steady beeping. Hannah didn't answer. She was already moving to establish a second line, already knowing what would be needed before Chen called for it. The RN across from her was watching now, understanding that this wasn't textbook nursing. This was something else entirely. But that wasn't the worst part, because Dr. Marcus Whitfield was standing in the observation window above the trauma bay, his arms crossed, his expression shifting from annoyance to something far more calculating. He watched Hannah work for 8 full minutes. Watched her anticipate hemorrhage patterns. Watched her establish lines with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced on wounded soldiers under fire. Watched her speak in a voice that didn't match her resume. Watched her hands move with the certainty of a surgeon, not a trauma nurse with barely 2 years of civilian experience. Hannah felt his eyes on her the way you feel a sniper's scope from 1,000 meters away, a prickling awareness that something dangerous had shifted in the room above. She didn't look up. She kept working. The Marine was stable now, vitals holding, bleeding controlled. Transport to OR was being called. The crisis was passing into the hands of the surgical team. At 16:30, Hannah was finishing her charting in the nurse's station when Whitfield's voice arrived before his shadow did. "My office. Now." Not a request. Not a suggestion. The kind of tone that made the other nurses look away, suddenly very focused on their own work. Hannah set down her pen carefully. Her jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. That was all. Then she stood and followed him down the corridor, past the supply rooms and the break area that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, to his office on the 3rd floor. Whitfield closed the door behind them with deliberate care. Not a slam. Something worse, a controlled click that suggested he had all the time in the world for this conversation. He moved behind his desk and leaned against it, arms crossed, the posture of someone settling in to enjoy themselves. "The Marine you treated today," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who'd spent years honing his ability to make threats sound like conversation. "Impressive work. Really quite exceptional." Hannah stood with her hands at her sides. She'd learned to stand this way in the field, visible, unthreatening, ready. "Thank you, Doctor." Almost too impressive, Whitfield continued, for someone with barely 2 years of civilian experience. He let that hang in the air between them, watching for cracks in her composure. "I've been reviewing your resume, Nurse Clarke. Your previous work history. The credentials you listed on your application." He picked up a folder from his desk. "Her file. I'm seeing some inconsistencies that are troubling me. Your field suture technique during the Marine's treatment was remarkably sophisticated. Palpation of femoral anatomy that suggested more than 2 years of practice. The way you moved around the trauma bay, almost like you'd anticipated every step before it happened." Hannah's breath remained steady. Her heart rate stayed controlled. The trembling, if it existed, was purely internal, the kind of trembling that came from restraint, from holding back something dangerous. "I was trained well," she said carefully. "The instructors at my nursing program emphasized practical skills." Whitfield smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nursing programs don't teach people to perform under extreme pressure the way you perform today. They don't teach the kind of tactical efficiency I observed. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He moved around his desk, closing the distance between them by a few feet. Not threatening, not yet. Just establishing dominance. "I'm going to be watching you very carefully, Nurse Clarke. Very carefully indeed. And effective immediately, you're being reassigned." "Sir." "You're off trauma rotation," he said, cutting her off before she could complete a sentence. "I'm reassigning you to general medical floors. Post-operative care. Nothing that requires your particular brand of expertise. Someone with more appropriate credentials will be handling the complex cases." Hannah's mission parameters flashed through her mind like red warning lights. Maintain cover. Maintain access. Her patient in room 407, the Navy intelligence officer recovering from his Helmand Province injuries, had confided in her 3 days ago about the mole. The person in Naval Medical Command who'd been feeding intelligence to hostile assets. He'd said, "You're the only one I trust." And now Whitfield was systematically cutting her off from every position that would allow her to protect him, to gather intelligence, to complete the assignment that had brought her to Seattle General in the first place. "I'd like to request reconsideration," Hannah said, her voice remaining level as a surgeon's hand. "My patient relationships are important. My assignments on trauma rotation allow me to maintain continuity of care. Your reassignment is not a request for input, Nurse Clarke." Whitfield moved back behind his desk, already dismissing her from his presence. "General medical floors. Starting tomorrow morning. You'll report to Nurse Manager Patricia in the East Wing at 0700 hours. Now get out of my office." Hannah turned and left without a word. She didn't close the door. She left it open the way Whitfield did, with the kind of control that suggested she wasn't fleeing or retreating, just moving to her next position. The hallway was silent except for the fluorescent lights buzzing their electrical hymn overhead. She could feel Whitfield watching her through the window of his office as she walked away, understanding in the calculation of his gaze that he'd just made a tactical error. He didn't know who he was standing next to. That evening, Hannah found herself standing outside room 407, her shift nearly over. The Navy intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Davies, was sitting up in bed, watching the news on a muted television. He looked better than he had a week ago. Color returning to his face. The infection from his Helmand Province injuries beginning to clear. But his eyes held a different kind of worry. "They're moving me tomorrow," he said before she could even check his vitals. His voice was barely above a whisper. "To a different floor. I overheard Dr. Whitfield on the phone this afternoon, making arrangements. Demanding access to my medical records. Asking questions about my background, my service history, my current status with naval intelligence." Hannah pulled up a chair and sat down beside him without asking permission. "You're safe here," she said quietly. "I was safe with you on this floor," Davies replied. His eyes were the grey of a North Atlantic in winter. "Once I move to General Medical, once you're not my primary nurse, once they separate us, I become vulnerable. That person in Naval Medical Command, the one I told you about, the mole, they have contacts. People watching placement decisions. People who know my name." Hannah's hands rested on her knees. Her knuckles were white from the pressure of self-control. But her voice remained calm, unaffected. "I'm working on it," she said. "Just maintain operational security. Don't discuss anything sensitive. Trust the protocol." "I'm trusting you," Davies said. "I hope that's the same thing." At 2100 hours, Whitfield made 4 phone calls from his office. Hannah watched through the observation window from the hallway. She could see his face reflected in the glass of the window, see him dialing, see the expression of satisfaction as each call connected. First call, Brad Harrington, the board member he golfed with every Saturday at the country club. They talked about Hannah's concerning elevation above her experience level and the need for credentialing review. Second call, someone from the state nursing board, a contact he'd cultivated over years of compliance committee work. Third call, a private investigator named Castellano who specialized in employment verification and background investigation. Fourth call, the hospital's credentialing committee chair, asking them to schedule an urgent review of new hire documentation for quality assurance purposes. He was building a file. Building a case. Creating institutional pressure from every angle simultaneously: medical hierarchy, state regulatory bodies, private investigation, institutional credentialing. He was cutting her off from her patient, cutting her off from her assignment, and he was doing it with surgical precision. It was competent. It was dangerous. And it was activating systems that would take 3 hours to respond once they realized what was happening. Hannah returned to her apartment at 2300 hours. She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, and she pulled out the tarnished military challenge coin from her pocket, the one from Helmand Province, the one that was supposed to stay hidden. The one that proved she'd been somewhere other than civilian nursing school. She turned it over and over between her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the history of it, the reminder of everyone she'd failed to protect before she'd been reassigned to this undercover operation. At 03 for 7 hours, her secure phone vibrated on the table. Single text message from an encrypted number, hostage extraction protocol activated. ETA 3 hours. The code alarm screamed at 0200 hours. Room 407. Hannah's monitored patient. Her hands moved before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory overriding exhaustion. She was already moving, already running, the corridor blurring past monitors and 4 poles and the fading voices of night shift nurses calling behind her. The alarm wailed like a siren in her chest, not fear, never fear, but the sharp crystalline focus of someone who had heard worse sounds in darker places. She burst through room 407's door to find her patient's eyes rolling back, his lips already turning the color of storm clouds. The on-call resident stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the monitor as if disbelief could reverse the flat line climbing toward the top of the screen. Blood pressure 70/40. Then 62. Then 58. The patient's chest heaved in shallow, desperate gasps. Cardiac tamponade. Hannah knew it the way she knew the smell of diesel and blood and Afghan dust. The pericardial sac was filling with fluid, crushing the heart like a fist closing around a bird. Without intervention in the next 3 minutes, there would be no intervention at all. The patient would be gone. Call for pericardiocentesis kit, Hannah said. Not a request. A command. Her voice had dropped an octave without her meaning to, the timid civilian nurse persona sliding away like a shed skin. Now. And get me 500 milliliters normal saline, 2 18-gauge needles, and a sterile field. The resident blinked. That procedure requires a physician. We need to page Dr. Whitfield. He'll arrive in 4 minutes. Your patient will be dead in 3. Hannah was already moving, already prepping the chest with the efficiency of someone who had executed this procedure in a forward surgical tent in Helmand Province with mortars thundering overhead and the taste of copper and fear in her mouth. She'd done this in the dark. She'd done this with trembling hands holding flashlights. She could do this in a climate-controlled hospital with full lighting and unlimited supplies. Move. The resident moved. Hannah's hands moved on their own. Skin prep with chlorhexidine in concentric circles. The tarnished challenge coin from Helmand sat in her scrub pocket like a stone, a talisman against the lie she was living. 20 years of training compressed into 4 minutes of pure instinct. Find the 5th intercostal space, midline. Palpate the landmarks. The needle went in with a small, clean pop through the skin. She advanced it toward the pericardial space at a 45-degree angle, her fingers steady as surgical lasers despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not the bright arterial red that would mean she'd hit the heart itself, that would be the end. But dark venous blood accumulated in the space around the heart, suffocating it with every beat. Fluid reaccumulated. Pressure building. Killing him. She withdrew the needle with a controlled motion. The hiss of air escaped as pressure equalized. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed. Slowed again. Blood pressure 80. 85. 90. The patient gasped, his eyes clearing, color flooding back into his face like someone surfacing from deep water. 4 minutes. Total elapsed time from alarm to stabilization, 4 minutes and 16 seconds. The entire room exhaled. That was when the door opened. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood in the doorway, his face a study in slowly dawning comprehension. His eyes moved from the patient, now breathing normally, vitals stabilizing, to Hannah, still bent over the bedside with the needle in her gloved hand. His gaze landed on the empty pericardiocentesis kit, the sterile field, the evidence of what had just occurred in his hospital without his authorization, without his knowledge, without his presence. His face went the color of wet concrete. "What?" he said very quietly, "the hell do you think you're doing?" Hannah met his gaze. She did not lower her eyes. She did not apologize. She did not flinch. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Acute cardiac tamponade. Your patient was in cardiogenic shock. That procedure requires physician supervision. Whitfield's voice was velvet over steel, the dangerous kind of anger that does not raise in volume but somehow becomes louder anyway, like a predator's growl in the dark. You just practice medicine beyond your scope of licensure. You have no authority to perform invasive procedures. You are a nurse, not a surgeon. Not even a resident. Your patient would have died in the 4 minutes it would have taken you to arrive from wherever you were. Hannah's voice had not changed. It remained steady, measured, stripped of the deference he had trained her to perform. His cardiac output was collapsing. His blood pressure was 58. I performed an emergency intervention to prevent immediate death. Any reasonable nurse would have done the same. No reasonable nurse, Whitfield said softly, stepping into the room, would have known how. His eyes narrowed. Where did you learn to perform that procedure? Show me your certification. Show me your training record. Hannah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Get out, Whitfield said. You are suspended, effective immediately. Pending investigation by the Credentialing Committee, Risk Management, and Hospital Administration. You will surrender your badge and ID and report to HR at 0600. You will not enter this hospital again without written authorization from the Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Whitfield, the resident started, the patient was coding. She saved his life. I don't care if she parted the Red Sea, Whitfield said, his voice cutting like a blade. She performed an invasive procedure beyond her scope. That is a matter for the legal department. His eyes locked onto Hannah's. You are done here. Understood. Hannah set down the needle on the sterile field. She removed her gloves with deliberate, controlled movements. She met his gaze one final time and saw it, the fear. Underneath the anger, underneath the authority, underneath all of it was fear. He saw something in her that terrified him. Something that didn't fit into his carefully constructed hierarchy, his network of golf buddies and regulators and board members who owed him favors. She didn't know yet that his fear was correct. She didn't know that her patient in room 407 was carrying intelligence about a mole embedded in Naval Medical Command, or that her identity had been compromised the moment she performed that procedure with the skill of someone who had trained at Bethesda Naval Hospital, at SEAL Team Forward surgical sites, in places that didn't exist on any civilian resume. She only knew that she had broken cover. She had made herself visible. And in the military, visibility to the wrong people meant compromise. By 0300, Whitfield had made his first call. By 0350, he had called the chair of the Credentialing Committee. By 0400, he had personally delivered the suspension notice to hospital administration, complete with documentation of the unauthorized procedure, the lack of physician supervision, the flagrant violation of scope of practice. He had already activated the network he'd spent 17 years building, board members who owed him consideration, state licensing board contacts who remembered his letters of recommendation, a private investigator with deep connections to data brokers and background check services. By 0405, the suspension was official. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, known to Seattle General as a civilian trauma nurse with 2 years of experience, was relieved of duty pending investigation. By 0500, Hannah received the formal letter. By 0530, she had walked out of Seattle General's employee entrance one final time, her badge already deactivated, her access already revoked. By 0600, she should have reported to HR. Instead, at 0630, she was sitting in a booth at an empty diner 6 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place where night shift workers went to drink terrible coffee and stare at the rain. The rain hammered against the windows like applause from a crowd that didn't care. Hannah stared at her reflection in the dark glass, watching the ghost of herself dissolve into the streetlights outside. She had saved her patient's life. She had kept her cover for 6 months. She had executed a perfect deep cover operation right up until the moment she made the choice that would end it. The tarnished challenge coin turned over and over between her fingers. Brass, scarred and worn from sand and time, stamped with the insignia of her unit, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The only piece of her real life she had allowed herself to carry. The only physical proof that Hannah Clarke was not a civilian trauma nurse with 2 years of experience, but something infinitely older and stranger. She turned the coin over. Heads. Then tails. Then heads again. Mission parameters were explicit: maintain cover at all costs. Blow your identity and you blow the entire operation. Her patient had information about a mole in Naval Medical Command. He trusted her because she had saved his life in Helmand Province. He would confide in her because she was the only person in this hospital who understood what it meant to have blood on your hands and still have to move forward. Now she was suspended. Now she was visible. Now she had 72 hours before the hospital's investigation formally documented her military-grade surgical skills, before the investigator connected the dots, before someone realized that her civilian experience was a perfect fabrication and started asking questions about who she really was and who had sent her and why. The coffee grew cold in her cup. Hannah Clarke closed her eyes and waited for the phone to ring. She knew it would. She knew that somewhere in the Pentagon, someone had received a priority call from a Marine Corps combat medic who recognized the field suture technique. She knew that ETA was already being calculated by people who moved in the dark and didn't bother with civilian niceties like chain of command or proper channels. 3 hours. Her patient had said 3 hours, and the clock was already counting down. The coin turned over in her fingers one more time. In the rain-dark glass of the diner window, her reflection was a stranger. A woman with hands that had held lives together on 3 continents. A woman who had surrendered everything to become nobody. A woman who was about to stop being invisible and remember exactly who she was. The rain hammered harder against the glass. And somewhere over the city of San Diego, helicopter rotors were already starting to turn. 8 vehicles rolled into Seattle General's main entrance at 0800 hours. Not ambulances. Not delivery trucks. A military convoy moving with the precision of a guided missile, each vehicle black and deliberate, tires gripping the rain-slicked asphalt like a predator's claws finding purchase. The rotor wash from the support Black Hawk overhead shook the windows of the trauma wing, and hospital staff froze mid-stride. Nobody needed to ask what this was. Everybody knew. Rear Admiral James Holloway stepped out first, his dress blues immaculate despite the rain, his presence moving through the lobby like a tank rolling through a village, unstoppable, reshaping every variable around him. Behind him, a security detail of 12 moved with the choreographed efficiency of operators who'd cleared hostile compounds for a living. Not police. Not hospital security. This was active-duty military intelligence security, and the lobby suddenly felt 7 degrees colder. The Admiral's aide approached the information desk, eyes forward, jaw set like carved granite. "I need to speak with Valkyrie. Now." The name hung in the air like a live round, nobody moved. A nurse near the elevator whispered something to her colleague. Somewhere above, a code was being called, then immediately cancelled. The pneumatic doors to the surgical ward hissed open and closed. The Admiral didn't acknowledge any of it. He simply waited, boots clicking against the tile floor with a rhythm like a metronome counting down something explosive. Hospital security materialized, a Navy veteran named Peterson, 47 years old, who'd spent 12 years in the submarine service before taking a civilian job that paid better and asked fewer questions. He took one look at the Admiral's rank insignia, the security details bearing, the sheer organizational mass of the United States military stepping through his lobby, and something in his spine straightened that he didn't know was bent. His hand moved to his radio without thinking about it. "Patient services, I have a senior command request in the main lobby." The words came out strange in his own voice, the military part of him surfacing like a submarine rising from the deep. He walked toward the Admiral with his shoulders back and his chin level. "Sir, Master Chief Petty Officer Clarke is currently suspended, sir. Pending investigation." He said it loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Loud enough for Dr. Whitfield, standing 40 feet away near the credentialing office, to hear every syllable. The Admiral's eyes cut to Whitfield for exactly 1 second, a look that contained more information than a report, more threat than an interrogation, then turned back to Peterson. When he spoke, his voice carried a kind of weight that comes from 40 years of command, from ordering men into harm's way, from making decisions that changed continents. "I'm Rear Admiral James Holloway, Joint Special Operations Command. I'm going to read you something." He pulled a tablet from his aide's hands. The screen glowed in the fluorescent hospital light. "Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Service number 167 for 829. 3 tours in Helmand Province. 2 Navy crosses for valor under fire. Architect of forward surgical protocols that became the standard doctrine across all forward operating bases in Central Command." He paused, letting each word settle into the room like heavy stones into still water. "Those protocols have saved 247 lives. Combat lives. American lives. Another pause. She is currently on classified assignment, a fact that apparently nobody in this hospital bothered to verify before suspending her. He lowered the tablet. Behind him, 2 FBI agents in dark suits positioned themselves on either side of the lobby's main corridor. Which brings me to the small matter of falsified federal documents. The lobby went silent. Not a shift in volume. Complete, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that happens when you realize you've made a miscalculation so profound it has become visible, tangible, a physical force pressing down on the room. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone the color of hospital primer, that institutional beige you saw on walls nobody cared about anymore. His hands moved to his pockets, then back to his sides, searching for a balance that no longer existed. The credentialing committee chair he'd golfed with for 6 years suddenly became very interested in the vending machine across the lobby. The board member who'd taken his call at midnight found an urgent email that required her immediate attention elsewhere. Hospital administration, which had moved so quickly to accept his narrative, had just become a building full of people with selective memory. "We have evidence," the Admiral continued, and there was something almost regretful in his voice, like he was explaining why a child couldn't have a toy anymore, "that you contacted a private investigator. That you requested fabricated employment complaints be inserted into federal databases. That you attempted to alter the service record of an active duty military officer." The FBI agent on the left stepped forward, holding up a tablet displaying email chains, digital timestamps, phone logs. The second agent had already begun moving toward Whitfield with the kind of fluid grace that comes from having done this more times than most people had had conversations. Whitfield's mouth opened. His voice came out as a rasp. "This is insane. I was protecting patient safety. She performed a procedure without supervision." The agent flipped the tablet around again, and even from across the lobby, people could see red highlighted sections of email text. 2:22 a.m. Utah Davidson Investigations. Quote, "I need employment history destroyed by 0800. Can fabricate medical board complaints in federal system access. We have 3 years of retainer payments. $47,000 in wire transfers." The agent's voice was the voice of someone reading a grocery list, no judgment, no theater, just fact moving from point A to point B with the inevitability of physics. The handcuffs came out from the agent's belt with a soft metallic whisper. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of government documents, and attempted tampering with military personnel records." Whitfield tried to back up, and bumped directly into the second agent. No, there's been a misunderstanding." The cuffs closed around his wrists with a click that echoed across the tile floor like a gavel. His protest started immediately, a stream of words that became background noise, the desperate machinery of someone watching their infrastructure collapse in real time, unable to process the speed or the scale of it. As the agents guided him toward the exit, his assistant, a young administrative coordinator who'd spent 2 years photographing Whitfield's triumphs for the hospital newsletter he'd controlled, snapped photos with her phone. The shots would go nowhere. Nobody wanted them. The gallery of his authority had become a crime scene, and she was documenting the perp walk of a man whose name would be off the surgical schedule before lunch. The boots of the security detail echoed against the tile floor in perfect synchronization as they moved Whitfield through the lobby. His voice bounced off the walls. "This is a mistake, this isn't how medicine works. I was following protocol, but nobody was listening." The nurses who'd had their food trays knocked away stood motionless, watching him pass. The residents whose schedules he'd controlled with an iron hand suddenly seemed very busy reviewing patient charts. The room itself seemed to contract around him, rejecting him, every eye watching his removal like a surgical team watching an infection get cleaned out. Hannah stood near the medication station, still in civilian clothes, jeans, a blue jacket, no badge yet because she hadn't been cleared to wear one. The Admiral's eyes found her in the crowd. He excused himself from Peterson with a nod that was almost casual, and walked toward her with the kind of directness that comes from a life spent moving through uncertainty. Behind him, the security detail formed a protective perimeter, though Hannah didn't need protection anymore. She'd never needed it. She'd simply needed somebody to believe it. The Admiral stopped 3 feet away, eyes level with hers, and something passed between them, a recognition, a confirmation, a moment of witnessing. Your cover held for 6 months, Master Chief. The intelligence we gathered from your asset will prevent a catastrophic breach. 3 compromised officers are already in custody. The security hole closes today. He paused, letting that weight settle. Well done. Hannah's hand drifted to her pocket, feeling the tarnished challenge coin, the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to carry. It was warm from her body heat, familiar as a heartbeat. Permission to complete my shift, sir. Her voice had dropped an octave somewhere in the last 3 hours. The deferential nurse was gone. What remained was someone else entirely. The Admiral's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough that the security detail relaxed by maybe 2 degrees. Permission granted, Master Chief. We'll debrief in 72 hours. He turned back toward the lobby, where the convoy was already being readied for departure. The Black Hawk rotor spun up with a sound like the world being unmade and reassembled. Hannah walked back to the nurse's station where her colleagues stood in stunned silence. Her shift supervisor, a woman named Margaret who'd worked here for 19 years, made a sound that was almost but not quite a laugh. You were. The words couldn't find their shape in her throat. Hannah didn't answer. She simply clocked in and moved toward the trauma wing, where room for 07 was waiting, where the intelligence officer was recovering, where a new shift was beginning under different rules now. As she walked past the medication station, she heard one of the newer nurses whisper, "Did she just get the military to show up?" Another nurse responded, "That wasn't military. That was special operations." The first nurse said quietly, "Same thing." And that, exactly, was the point nobody understood until it mattered. 6 months later, Hannah returned to active duty. The intelligence her protected asset had provided led to the arrest of 3 compromised Naval Medical Command officers and the dismantling of a foreign intelligence network that had been embedded in federal healthcare infrastructure since 2018. 314 lives were saved by the information she'd protected, monitored, and delivered. The tarnished challenge coin now sat displayed in the Admiral's office in a small glass case with a plaque, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Operation Valkyrie. The coin that had been dismissed as nothing, worthless, forgotten, had become proof of something that couldn't be forged or denied. At Seattle General, Hannah's forward surgical protocols were implemented hospital-wide. In the first quarter after implementation, they saved 17 lives. The surgical mortality rate dropped 4%. The credentialing committee quietly updated their oversight procedures. The board created a new position, Chief Clinical Integrity Officer. The position was filled by someone from outside the organization, someone with no golf buddies in the system, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain by telling the truth. Dr. Whitfield, stripped of his medical license after a 3-week federal trial, barred from every federal healthcare facility and most state-licensed hospitals, arrived each morning at 0700 at the San Diego Community College Adult Education Center. He set up plastic CPR mannequins in a fluorescent-lit classroom with a wall of inspirational posters about new beginnings. He earned $28 per hour, which was less than the parking permit at the country club where his colleagues still had memberships he could no longer afford. His golf buddies didn't return calls. The board members who'd taken his advice had selective amnesia. His assistant now worked in the hospital's trauma department as an administrative coordinator for the new trauma director, a woman who'd been quietly removed from active cases while Whitfield was in power and had just been proven right about everything she'd said. His former office became a collaborative workspace. His name came off 3 journal articles and was struck from a medical textbook in revision. In his small apartment decorated with furniture from a rental company, he kept a newspaper clipping about his arrest, something to take out on nights when he couldn't sleep, a reminder that the hierarchy he'd believed was permanent had dissolved in exactly 3 hours. Hannah shipped out to her next classified assignment, a new challenge coin in her pocket, the weight of it a comfort she'd never admitted to missing. Before she left San Diego, she visited the Marine Corps combat medic who had recognized her field suture technique in room for 12, the one who'd made the call that set everything in motion. They sat on the hood of a Navy truck in the parking lot of Camp Pendleton, watching the sun drop into the Pacific like a burning coin. "You were right," Hannah said, her voice carrying that new depth it had acquired, "about Helmand Province. About what the scar tissue on my hands meant." The Marine nodded with the kind of respect that exists only between people who've carried weight nobody else can understand. "Thank you for your service, Master Chief." Hannah turned toward him, and for the first time since the lobby of Seattle General, she let something that resembled a real emotion cross her face. "The thanks belong to everyone who held the line while I was pretending to be someone else." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Hannah said words that would follow her through every mission after: "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, or if you've watched institutional corruption finally get dismantled, leave a comment below. And if you know someone who's carrying a secret that could change everything, make sure they know they don't have to carry it alone. Please subscribe for more stories about the ones who protect us from the shadows, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video.